The true origin of the American Revolution. What historians get wrong. Picture the scene everyone remembers. December 1773. A cold Boston night. Men disguised as Mohawk warriors climb aboard 3 ships in the harbor and dump 340 chests of tea into the sea. The Boston Tea Party. It is the image stamped onto the origin of the United States. Plucky colonists, a tyrannical king, a tax on tea, and the birth of a revolution. It is a wonderful story. And as an explanation for why the American Revolution happened, it is almost completely misleading. Because the tea was not really the point. The tax on tea was tiny. In fact, the law the colonists were protesting in 1773 actually made tea cheaper. Read that again. They were rioting over a measure that lowered the price of their favorite drink. So if it wasn't about the cost of tea, what was it about? The real answer is not a story about tea or even mainly about taxes. It is a story about debt. Specifically, it is about a mountain of debt run up by the British Empire winning a world war, and the explosive question of who was going to pay it off. The American Revolution did not begin in Boston Harbor. It began in the counting houses of London, with an empire that had won everything and could not afford its own victory. This is the story of how a financial crisis became a revolution. To understand it, we have to start not with a tax, but with a war. And not the Revolutionary War, the war before it. From 1756 to 1763, Britain and France fought what was, in effect, the First True World War. It was waged in Europe, in India, in the Caribbean, on the oceans, and in the forests of North America, where the colonists called it the French and Indian War. Britain won, and it won colossally. At the Peace of Paris in 1763, France was expelled from mainland North America. Britain took Canada and all the territory east of the Mississippi. On the map, the British Empire had become the greatest power on earth. But victory on that scale is not free. And when the bills came in, they were staggering. Before the war in 1756, the British national debt stood at around £75 million. By 1763, it had nearly doubled to roughly £133 million. These are numbers that are hard to feel across the centuries, so here's the part that matters. The interest payments alone on that debt consumed more than half of the entire British government budget. Every year, over half of what the state took in went straight back out the door just to service what it had borrowed. A government spending half its income on interest is a government in crisis, and that crisis was the true engine of everything that followed. Now, the men running Britain looked at this mountain of debt and asked a reasonable question. This war, they reasoned, had been fought in large part to protect the American colonies from the French and their native allies. The colonists were the beneficiaries. The colonies were, by this point, remarkably prosperous. Colonial Americans arguably enjoyed one of the highest standards of living in the entire Western world, and they paid extraordinarily low taxes compared to Britons back home. A subject in England paid many times more in tax than a subject in Massachusetts or Virginia. So the question that would tear the empire apart was born, and it was, at its heart, an accounting question. Who should pay for the empire? To the British Parliament, the answer was obvious. The colonies should contribute their fair share, especially toward the cost of their own defense. Because the war had not really ended Britain's military problem in America. It had created a new one. Britain now controlled a vast new interior, full of French settlers and powerful native nations. In 1763, a major native uprising known as Pontiac's Rebellion swept the frontier, and it took real military force to contain. London concluded that it needed to keep a standing army of around 10,000 soldiers permanently stationed in North America. The estimated cost of that army was about £200,000 a year, every year indefinitely. Someone had to pay for those troops, and Parliament decided it should be the Americans. This is the moment the machinery of revolution starts to turn. Watch how each step follows logically from the debt, and how each one deepens the crisis. The first move came even before the famous taxes. Britain decided that if the colonies were going to help fund the empire, The empire first had to stop the colonies from cheating it. And American merchants had been cheating it magnificently for decades through smuggling. For a century, Britain had run its empire under a philosophy called mercantilism. The theory was that colonies existed for the economic benefit of the mother country. A web of laws called the Navigation Acts required that colonial trade be carried on British ships, and that valuable colonial goods be funneled through British ports. In principle, this bottled up American commerce for London's profit. In practice, Americans smuggled around it constantly, especially in the lucrative trade of molasses from the French and Dutch Caribbean, which they distilled into rum. For years, London had tolerated this through what one politician later called salutary neglect, the deliberate policy of not enforcing the rules too closely, because the whole system was making everyone money and keeping the colonists content. After 1763, salutary neglect was over. A bankrupt empire could no longer afford to look the other way. In 1764, the government of Prime Minister George Grenville passed the Sugar Act. Now, here is the part that is genuinely counterintuitive. The Sugar Act actually lowered the tax on molasses, cutting it from 6 pence a gallon to 3. It sounds like a gift. It was anything but. Because alongside the lower rate came a fierce new apparatus of enforcement. Customs officers were ordered to actually collect the duty. The Royal Navy was deployed to hunt smugglers, and accused violators would be tried not before sympathetic local juries of their neighbors, but in vice admiralty courts run by a single crown-appointed judge with no jury at all. For the first time, ordinary colonial merchants felt the empire reaching directly into their business, not to make money with them, but to extract money from them, and to bypass their own courts to do it. The principle was being established quietly in the language of customs duties long before anyone shouted about tea. Then, in 1765, came the measure that turned grumbling into a movement. The Stamp Act. The Stamp Act required that a vast range of printed materials in the colonies be produced on special stamped paper, carrying an embossed tax. Not just legal documents, but newspapers, pamphlets, licenses, contracts, even playing cards and dice. It was designed to raise money directly inside the colonies to help pay for that standing army. And it landed like a bomb. To understand why, you have to see who it hit. The Stamp Act fell most heavily on the most articulate and organized groups in colonial society. Lawyers who needed stamps for every legal filing, merchants who needed them for shipping papers, and above all, printers and newspapermen, whose entire product was now taxed on every sheet. The British could hardly have designed a tax more perfectly calibrated to enrage the exact people most capable of shaping public opinion. But the deepest objection was not the cost. It was a principle, and it was the principle that would become the soul of the revolution. No taxation without representation. The colonists made a crucial distinction. They acknowledged Parliament's right to regulate the trade of the empire, to pass laws like the Navigation Acts governing commerce across the whole system. What they denied was Parliament's right to reach inside the colonies and levy a direct internal tax on the colonists themselves, for the sole purpose of raising revenue when not a single American sat in that parliament to consent to it. The British had an answer, and it is important to understand it because they were not simply being stupid or cruel. Their doctrine was called virtual representation. Members of Parliament, they argued, did not represent only the specific towns that elected them. Each member represented the interests of the entire British Empire, everywhere. So the colonists were represented in Parliament in the same way that the great English city of Manchester was, which also elected no members of its own. Every Briton was virtually represented, whether they voted or not. To the Americans, this was a transparent fiction. The idea that a member for some rural English district represented the interests of a farmer in Virginia or a merchant in Boston was, to them, absurd. Their own elected colonial assemblies had taxed them for generations. Those assemblies, they insisted, were the only bodies with the right to tax Americans. So underneath the argument about stamps and duties, a far deeper question had surfaced. Where did real power in the empire actually lie? With a parliament 3,000 miles away or with the colonial legislatures the Americans had built themselves? The response to the Stamp Act stunned London. 9 colonies sent delegates to a Stamp Act Congress, the first time they had coordinated politically on such a scale. Merchants organized boycotts of British goods, and crowds calling themselves the Sons of Liberty took to the streets, intimidating the stamp distributors into resigning, sometimes with tar and feathers, so that when the act took effect, there was almost no one left willing to sell the stamps. The boycott worked where petitions had not, because it hit British merchants in their own ledgers. Pressured by their own business class in 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. The Americans celebrated, but they had missed the fine print, and the fine print was everything. On the very same day it repealed the Stamp Act, Parliament passed something called the Declaratory Act. It made no mention of taxes. It simply asserted that Parliament had full authority to make laws binding the colonies, in the sweeping phrase, in all cases whatsoever. Britain had retreated on the specific tax while planting its flag on the underlying principle. The core dispute, who holds sovereign power, was not resolved. It was merely postponed. And a postponed constitutional crisis, sitting on top of an unpaid national debt, was a fire that had not gone out, only gone quiet. It did not stay quiet for long because the debt did not go away, and Britain still needed the money. In 1767, a new set of taxes arrived, named after the chancellor who devised them, Charles Townshend. The Townshend Acts were, in a way, an attempt to be clever. Since the Americans had objected to internal taxes but had seemed to accept external duties on trade, Townshend placed new duties on goods imported into the colonies: glass, paint, paper, lead, and tea. He assumed this would slip past their objections. It did not. By now, the colonists had sharpened their thinking. It was not the location of the tax that mattered, internal or external, it was the purpose. A duty meant to regulate trade was acceptable. A duty whose real aim was to raise revenue from Americans without their consent was not, no matter where it was collected. And the Townshend program contained something even more threatening than the duties themselves. Part of the revenue was earmarked to pay the salaries of colonial governors and judges directly from London. Grasp why that mattered so much. Until then, colonial assemblies had held a vital lever of power. They paid the salaries of royal officials. A governor who defied the assembly could find his pay withheld. It was the colonists' single greatest check on royal authority. By moving those salaries to the crown's payroll, Britain was quietly trying to cut the strings that gave the assemblies their leverage, making officials answerable only to London. This was not just about money anymore. It was about severing the mechanisms of self-government the colonists had spent generations building. The response was another round of boycotts and rising friction, especially in Boston, where British troops had been stationed to keep order. Soldiers and townspeople rubbed against each other daily. In March 1770, that friction ignited. A mob harassed a group of soldiers. The soldiers opened fire, and 5 colonists lay dead. It was branded in a brilliant stroke of propaganda by Paul Revere and Samuel Adams, the Boston Massacre. That same year, facing yet another failed and costly boycott, Parliament backed down again, repealing most of the Townshend duties. But once more it kept one, deliberately as a matter of principle. It kept the tax on tea, a small symbolic reminder that Parliament still claimed the right. And that is what finally brings us, correctly this time, to the tea. By 1773, the tea tax was a minor irritant that most colonists had learned to live with, largely by smuggling cheaper Dutch tea. But in that year, Parliament passed the Tea Act. Its purpose was not primarily to tax America at all. It was to rescue the British East India Company, a vast, politically connected corporation that was drowning in debt and sitting on enormous unsold stocks of tea. The Tea Act let the company ship its tea directly to the colonies and undercut everyone, including the American smugglers. As a result, legal British tea, even with the tax included, would now be cheaper than the smuggled kind. And this is the detail that unlocks the whole story. The colonists were being offered cheaper tea, and they violently refused it. Why? Because they saw the trap. If they bought the cheap taxed tea, they would be accepting, with their own wallets, Parliament's right to tax them. It was a bribe disguised as a bargain. Accepting it meant conceding the principle they had defended for a decade, and they would not. So when the tea ships arrived in Boston, a group organized by the Sons of Liberty boarded them and threw the whole cargo into the harbor. The Boston Tea Party was not a tax revolt. It was the deliberate destruction of valuable private property to reject a constitutional principle, even when that principle came wrapped in a discount. Now the logic of the story reaches its climax, because London finally saw the destruction of the tea for what it was, not a protest but a challenge to sovereignty itself, and it resolved to crush it. In 1774, Parliament passed a series of laws the Americans called the Intolerable Acts. They closed the port of Boston until the tea was paid for, strangling the city's economy. They stripped Massachusetts of much of its cherished self-government, placing it under direct crown control. They allowed royal officials accused of crimes to be tried in Britain, away from colonial juries. Britain intended these acts to isolate Massachusetts and make a frightening example of it. Instead, they did the opposite. The other colonies saw that what had been done to Massachusetts could be done to any of them. If Parliament could annihilate the charter of one colony and close its port at will, then no colony's liberties and no colony's property were safe. The Intolerable Acts converted a Boston quarrel into a continental cause. In response, 12 colonies sent delegates to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in the autumn of 1774. They came to coordinate resistance to a parliament that now seemed determined to rule them by force. Within months, in April 1775, British troops marched out of Boston to seize colonial weapons at Concord. On the way at Lexington, a shot was fired, and the argument about who should pay for the empire finally became a war over who should govern it. So step back and look at the true shape of what happened, because it is so different from the schoolbook version. The American Revolution was not caused by a tax on tea. The tea was the last act, not the first. The revolution was caused by a chain reaction that began with a debt. Britain won a world war and doubled its national debt. Interest on that debt devoured half its budget. To fund the debt and the army that came with a new empire, Britain tried, for the first time, to make the colonies pay direct revenue. Each attempt, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Duties, the Tea Act, provoked resistance not mainly because of its cost, but because of the principle buried inside it. And each time Britain retreated on the tax while insisting on the principle, until the two sides were arguing not about money at all, but about sovereignty. That is the piece the Tea Party story hides. The colonists were not, at bottom, cheap. They were among the least taxed people in the Western world, and they knew it. They were fighting about something they understood to be more valuable than a few pence on a pound of tea. They were fighting about who had the right to reach into their pockets and who had the right to govern their affairs. And this reveals a pattern that reaches far beyond 1776. Empires are expensive. Winning wars is expensive. And the deepest political conflicts often ignite not over the spending itself, but over the bill. Over who is forced to pay for decisions made by people far away, in whose making they had no voice. The genius of the American argument was to take an accounting dispute and transform it into a philosophical one. The British asked, "Why won't you pay your share?" The Americans answered with a different question entirely. By what right do you decide our share, when we have no seat at the table where the decision is made? That question, no taxation without representation, was never really about tea or stamps or molasses. It was about consent. It was the claim that legitimate power must flow from the people it governs, not be imposed on them from across an ocean by a parliament in which they had no voice. So the next time you picture those men in the harbor tossing chests of tea into the cold Atlantic, remember what they were actually rejecting. Not an expensive drink, a cheap one. They threw away a bargain because they understood that the true price of that tea was not printed on the tax stamp. The true price was their consent to be ruled without a voice. And that was the one thing they would not pay. Wars are settled by treaties, but the debts they leave behind can outlast the peace, and the fight over who pays those debts can bring down the very empire that won the war. Britain defeated France and gained a continent. In trying to make that continent pay for itself, it lost the most valuable part of it entirely. The revolution did not begin with a tax on tea. It began with the price of victory and the question no empire can avoid forever: who pays?